They thought I was just an assistant, until my name was on the contract. And from the very beginning, that was the role they assigned me without ever asking, because I was always the one taking notes, forwarding emails, organizing files, and making sure everything ran smoothly in the background, which made it easy for them to believe that I existed somewhere below the decisions, below the authority, and definitely below the recognition. And I didn't correct that assumption at first, not because it was accurate, but because correcting it would have required explaining things to people who had already decided what my value looked like. And I learned quickly that once people place you into a category, especially a convenient one, they stop listening for information that contradicts it. So I stayed where they expected me to stay. I did my job well. I stayed polite. I stayed responsive. And I stayed invisible in the ways that made them comfortable, while paying very close attention to how decisions were actually made, who approved what, who signed what, and how often confidence replaced verification, because most of them didn't realize how much of their authority depended on habit rather than structure. And while they spoke loudly in meetings and debated strategies, I noticed patterns forming underneath those conversations, the same shortcuts being taken, the same assumptions being repeated, and the same belief that nothing important could move forward without their explicit approval. A belief reinforced every time someone thanked them publicly while ignoring the systems that made their success possible. And the longer this went on, the more comfortable they became speaking over me, dismissing my suggestions as details, and referring to my role as support rather than involvement, which only strengthened their confidence and narrowed their attention. And I let that narrowing happen because attention is the first thing people lose when they feel secure, and once it's gone, they stop checking the boundaries that actually protect them. And during that time, I continued doing exactly what I had always done on the surface, responding quickly, staying organized, and keeping things moving, while quietly noticing how often my name appeared in places they never looked closely at, attached to documents they skimmed, processes they assumed were routine, and approvals they treated as automatic. And the irony was that none of this required deception or manipulation. It only required patience, because patience gives you time to understand how power actually works when no one thinks you're trying to access it. And by the time they joked openly about how I would never leave my assistant role, they had already stopped seeing me as someone whose position might change, which meant they never imagined that something fundamental was already shifting underneath their certainty. Over time, that assumption about me became so fixed that it shaped how everyone interacted with my work, because once people decide your support, they stop asking how things happen and start assuming they just do. And I watched that shift settle into the room during meetings, where my presence slowly turned from participation into background, my comments acknowledged with nods, but rarely followed, and my role reduced to execution rather than thought, which gave me a strange kind of freedom. Because expectations act like boundaries, and when those boundaries are low, movement inside them goes unnoticed. So while they debated strategies and argued over ideas, I focused on understanding the structure beneath those discussions, learning which approvals were symbolic and which ones actually mattered, noticing how often decisions were rushed through because everyone trusted the process without revisiting it, and realizing that trust, when left unexamined, becomes a shortcut, and shortcuts are where responsibility quietly shifts. And I didn't rush that understanding or try to prove anything with it, because proof invites resistance and resistance invites attention, and attention was exactly what I didn't want. So I stayed consistent and predictable, answering emails quickly, fixing problems before they escalated, and making sure deadlines were met, all of which reinforced their belief that I was reliable but harmless, useful but replaceable. And as that belief settled in, they began delegating more without checking, forwarding documents without reading closely, and signing off on things they assumed were routine. And I noticed how often my name appeared in those moments, attached to approvals, confirmations, and clauses that no one bothered to question because they trusted the flow more than the details. And the longer this continued, the more confident they became in their hierarchy, joking openly about titles, seniority, and who really mattered, never realizing that hierarchy only works when everyone involved understands it the same way. And while they were busy protecting their status through visibility and authority, I was learning that real leverage often hides in the parts of the system people stop reviewing once they feel safe. And by the time they started treating my presence as optional in conversations that didn't concern me, They had already given up the habit of monitoring the very processes that would later decide who actually held the final say. The shift didn't happen during a meeting or a confrontation, and that's what made it invisible to them for so long, because it happened quietly through paperwork, timelines, and assumptions that no one felt the need to revisit. And I remember the exact moment I realized how far their attention had drifted, when a document came through my inbox marked as routine, something everyone treated as a formality rather than a decision. And as I reviewed it, I noticed how casually responsibility had been redistributed across roles that no one questioned anymore, my role included, and I didn't rush to flag it or draw attention to it. Not because it was a mistake, but because it wasn't one. It was the natural result of a system that had been running on trust instead of verification for far too long. And as revisions went back and forth, my name stayed where it was, quietly attached to sections that mattered more than anyone realized. And every time the document moved forward, another layer of assumption locked into place. The assumption that nothing significant could change without a senior voice announcing it. The assumption that titles reflected authority, and the assumption that someone like me would never be positioned anywhere near the final decision. And I watched those assumptions protect me as much as they exposed them. Because no one slowed down to read closely, no one paused to ask why certain permissions had shifted, and no one imagined that a role they had labeled as supportive could carry any real weight. And when the contract was finally finalized, it arrived without ceremony, forwarded like any other attachment, skimmed rather than studied, and approved without discussion. And it wasn't until much later, when outcomes began to reflect decisions they didn't remember making, that confusion started to surface, not as panic at first, but as irritation, followed by subtle questions about how things had been structured and when certain responsibilities had changed. And even then, they looked everywhere except where the answer actually was. Because once people convinced themselves they understand the hierarchy, they stopped checking the documents that define it. And by the time someone finally noticed my name placed where they didn't expect it to be, it was no longer a question of correction or reversal. It was a realization that the system they trusted had already spoken, quietly, clearly, and without asking for their approval. The reaction didn't come all at once, and that was the part they struggled with most. Because there was no single moment they could point to and say this is where things went wrong. Only a slow realization that decisions were moving forward without looping back to them, approvals were happening without their input, and outcomes were aligning with a structure they didn't remember agreeing to. And as that realization set in, their confidence shifted into something more defensive, expressed through questions that sounded casual but carried urgency underneath, questions about process, about timing, about who had signed off on what and when. And when those questions eventually reached me, they were framed carefully, as if acknowledging my involvement too directly would make the situation more real than they were ready to accept. And I answered them plainly, without excitement and without apology, because the facts didn't require either. And the more factual the conversation became, the harder it was for them to argue against it, since arguing would have meant admitting that they hadn't been paying attention. And that admission was far more uncomfortable than adjusting to a new reality. So instead, they recalibrated, slowly and reluctantly, redefining roles in practice without ever openly discussing how those roles had changed. And during that period, I noticed how differently they spoke to me, more carefully, more directly, and with an awareness that hadn't been there before. And the irony was that nothing about my work had changed, only their perception of it. And as that perception shifted, so did the balance of the room. Because authority doesn't always arrive through announcement or confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through documentation, consistency, and the quiet moment when people realize that the structure they trusted has already decided. And by the time they fully accepted that my name was on the contract in a way that couldn't be ignored, the story they had been telling themselves about who I was no longer fit the reality in front of them. And there was no clean way to rewrite it without acknowledging how easily they had underestimated the person they thought they understood, which is why the ending wasn't dramatic or satisfying in the way revenge stories usually promise, but steady, irreversible, and quietly final. Because once authority moves into place without resistance, the only thing left to do is adjust to it.